So I'd first like to start with he's Morgan Wright, who's on my left. He's a internationally recognized expert in computer cybersecurity strategy, cyberterrorism, identity theft, and privacy. And he's been in front of Congress. He's made hundreds of appearances on the news stations in the United States. He's starting a podcast in June, and he's one of the experts in the panel. I would like to welcome him. And the next person, this way, it's going to be Larry. He's the CISO of the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative. It's a organization that basically they use technology. It seems they use technology to investigate human trafficking. And he's the CSO of this organization, and he's got experience in data centers and architecture, management support, and cybersecurity. Then we have Victor Beitner, Victor Beitner. He's a federal police investigator with the RCMP. He's currently assigned to INTERPOL Ottawa office. He has 19 years experience ranging from military, security, risk management, and law enforcement, having spent the last 10 years furthering criminal investigations relating to human trafficking. He is our SME on the topic of cyber. And I'd like to, there's so much to discuss that if you want to know more about them, you can get their bios here. You can go on LinkedIn and see who they are. They're really a powerful group. So I'd like to start off with just something that I was reading last night about. And this is this is terrible, but someone involved in the industry. He says that every 30 seconds, a child is sold for sex, labor, and organ harvesting. I don't know what to say. It's like, I can't believe this is happening today. And what makes it worse is that North America happens to be the largest consumer of these services. So I'd like to ask Morgan to start the process, and then we'll go around the table and get some comments on this topic. So Morgan.
Hey, thanks, Victor. One of the things, if we kind of frame this thing out, what it really boils down to is many, many, many years ago, remember, there was an old saying, Willie Sutton was a bank robber, and he said, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. We've progressed now to where somebody has to be physically present, to where now they can actually be remote and manage these things. So as we start talking today, we're going to see about how the evolution of technology has opened up an entirely new way of conducting clandestine business, of committing crimes, especially cyber crimes. Part of my background was in law enforcement, like Vic. I worked in the intelligence community, used to teach out at the National Security Agency. And we've watched this evolution of technology, but one of the things that we've always found with technology is no matter how great it is, somebody finds a way to use it to commit crimes. And many of you guys have heard about the dark web, and a lot of people go, well, the dark web, that was just a criminal thing to begin with. Actually, the dark web was invented by the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory to help human rights activists in these other countries communicate securely and safely. And now, guess what? It's being used primarily for the distribution of just horrendous types of child pornography. The original Silk Road was on there. It's all been underpinned by cryptocurrency. So the reason the dark web can exist is because of cryptocurrency like Bitcoin and the ability to monetize somewhat anonymously these things. So, Victor, if we just kind of think about where things were and where things have come. One last thing, too, is I used to be a senior advisor for the U.S. State Department Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program. I actually worked in countries like Pakistan, like Turkey, throughout the Middle East. And when the attacks happened in Mumbai, India, in November of 2008, a lot of those, the Lashkar-e-Taiba was the terrorist group. A lot of that was controlled remotely by people back in Pakistan through encrypted communications. They did not have to be there, which is normally what happens in the terrorist planning cycle. So we're seeing everything from human sex trafficking to the distribution of drugs, firearms, fentanyl, one of the biggest, the opioid crisis right now. A lot of that is fueled primarily, guess what, over the internet, and the payments are very tough to track. So, Victor, I hate to be a downer, but it really, technology has changed a lot of things for the better. But as with anything, dynamite was invented for peaceful purposes by Alfred Nobel. And guess what it was used for, ultimately. So, we've got to keep an eye on these things, because these things have a dual use to them. They can be used for good, but unfortunately, there are people out in this world that figure out how to use them for bad.
So we're talking about technology. So Larry, that's your forte in these investigations. You want to turn your mic on so we can hear you?
Yes.
There you go. So what have you seen with Morgan's comments, with the technology, with the investigating? You do the investigations with cryptocurrency, and basically your organization is follow the money.
Yeah.
So what can you tell us about what you've seen since you've started and how it's progressed to today?
So as for the dark web, we have our own dark web intelligence platform that we built. So it's currently indexing all the dark websites that we ingested. There was about 70,000 dark websites we found over the past month and a half. So about 20,000 of those are currently active. About 10,000 or a little more are actually CSAM sites we're able to auto-categorize with natural language processing. But we found about 13,000 Bitcoin addresses, and we actually have interns in there going out and categorizing them.
This is just in the past month and a half. These are all active sites, or 20,000 of them are active. And are they being used for money transferring or luring children and women into the world of human trafficking?
No, so you got your weapons, you got your drugs, like different marketplaces. Then you got these sites that are just set up to exchange the CSAM, so child sexual abuse material.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is more distribution, not focused on the human trafficking side. This is basically where the money is being moved through it, right?
Yeah, so they have videos and they buy videos. There's not as much trafficking. There are people that are actually selling people on the dark web, but I don't find there's much of that. The majority of the dark web is CSAM based on our latest stats.
Okay.
And there's small fractions, about 10% of drugs, 10% of marketplaces. They're very small, but you have around 56% that are CSAM related.
Okay, so go over to Victor, our international guy. What have you seen with the technology, and how is it making Interpol and RCMP and the FBI, how is it making it more difficult to capture these people? First, to find them, and then if you can prosecute them.
So that's a very good point, Victor. And just to correct something, I'm definitely not a cyber SME. I leave that to my two fellow panelists. I'm more a human trafficking SME. So what I can tell you is that I have also conducted research on part of my academic background into human trafficking. And what I do is I looked into the cooperation piece, and I looked into the crossover piece of human trafficking with other offenses. And Larry just touched a point that's very key in that, is that, yeah, we're seeing other types of crimes on the dark web. But what law enforcement is having an issue to do, it's to deal with human trafficking when there's a crossover, when there's a nexus with other types of offenses. And I'll give you very strong examples into that. Now, media, the private sector, has come up with several reports. Companies from the or organizations such as CISO, for instance, which is the Center for International Justice and Accountability, or you have Bellingcat, for instance, as well. You have Torn. There are companies that have come up with so much information. The media has come out with so much information about, for instance, let's say ISIS using human trafficking as a source for their operations, not only for personal gain, but as well, to terrorize populations, to recruit additional members. Boko Haram has been doing the same thing in Nigeria and etc., right? But we're having an issue from the law enforcement perspective and even internationally in connecting those dots, and that's where the problem it's happening more at the international level. So if you look into what's happening in Canada, for instance, what happened in the United States, you might see a transnational criminal organization operating in human trafficking in what we usually know, for instance, sexual exploitation, which is the biggest one, or the one that it's being more investigated per se. And you look at it, you can have someone that it's operating out of Africa on a platform, is using everything that it's social media. It can be using Facebook to recruit. It can be using any other platform, Kik, QQ, you name it. There's so many of them out there, and they're just recruiting, they're luring people into it. So that's the first step of human trafficking. It's the recruiting portion. And they don't even need to be physically, they don't need to be in touch with the victim. They're just doing that remotely through online platforms. And then it goes on through the exploitation and everything else. And when it comes out to Interpol and UNODC and other organizations like that at the international level, it's trying to raise awareness about that phenomenon and what's happening, because law enforcement is no longer operating on this traditional way where we used to do everything physically. You sit outside, you look at someone, you see them doing the crime or committing the crime. No, a trafficker can actually send someone to be exploited on a property that is rented via Airbnb. They can actually have the victim transported through Uber. None of the suspects is ever going to be seen on a surveillance. Neither of the subject is going to ever be present with the victim, but still an exploitation case of human trafficking. And that's, where we need that partnership with the private. We need people like Larry, we need people like Morgan that can bring out those things together and, can connect those dots and can, cooperate with law enforcement, because we've seen the cases of human trafficking. Everybody says that they're there, they're underreported, they're growing up in numbers, but the prosecutions are not.
So we're seeing now financial institutions are starting to cooperate. Like Morgan, do you have any? Are you familiar with any of the anything that's in the United States with financial organizations working with, the police services or with private organizations, helping them detect human trafficking in their regions?
A good friend of mine is John Clark. He's the head of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. John used to be the United States Marshal. The National Center for Missing Kids has a great relationship with the U.S. government, and also people now, they're realizing they need to have relationships with things called FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They've got to be able to track money. And Vic and both Larry have both talked about cartels and drugs. These lessons come directly from the cartels. The cartels learned long ago about how to move things, how to move people, how to move especially money. So when we start looking at these things, this is one of the reasons why with what's called CTR's currency transaction reporting, it used to be at $10,000. Then they started doing these things called smurfing, where they could figure out, hey, I could move 2 financial transactions of $5,000 and avoid the currency reporting requirements. Now we have a complicated structure when we start adding cryptocurrency on top of it, which is something Larry's been tracking. He can do a far, more extensive job telling you than I can, but I will tell you, number one, banks are probably the most heavily regulated industry next to pharmaceuticals. So nobody wants more regulation. So a lot of people don't even want the headache. They want to say, let's get ahead of this before the government comes in and starts regulating us. So I think you see a lot of cooperation, but here's the problem. And Vic alluded to it. This is transnational. This is not just North American. You've got people that have never touched set foot on North American soil that are managing human trafficking operations. And the people are moving here, but the money is flowing back there. So how do we get, and it's difficult. When you look at the recent ransomware botnet that was taken down by Interpol, by Europol, by the Dutch police, by the FBI, DHS, that was a very large, extensive effort to even take these guys offline. So if you can't do it, if it's so complex for that, every time you take one down, guess what happens? It's like a dope dealer on a street corner. Another one pops back up, right? So this is a systemic problem, is how do we address that? But to bring it full circle, yeah, I think you will see that. And I think they do it for a couple reasons. I'm not knocking banks, but look, banks will do things because they just don't want to be regulated. It may end up being something that's good for society, but at the end of the day, they just go, hey, look, we just don't want to be regulated. So we will do what it takes to keep the government off of our back and out of our banks. But this is one of those moral issues, I think, Victor, that needs to transcend regulation. I mean, if it was my kid and I knew a bank was not cooperating with law enforcement, I would be raising holy hell with these guys just from a moral standpoint. So I think there's moral issues, there's legal issues, and there's societal issues. But at the end of the day, man, the internet is a really, really, really large place. And we lack the authority to investigate in many of these countries where these crimes are occurring because we have no extradition treaty and no mutual legal assistance treaty.
Well, I think also what complicates it is it's not one organization you're going after. It's little groups that work independently. And they're basically doing the luring. Like, it's harder to catch them because, like you said, once you catch one, another one will pop up, maybe in the same town or village or wherever. So yeah, Larry, I think you had something to say.
Yeah, so this is one of the things we do with our data set. We provide it to financial institutions like banks. And it's just because that banks rely on like different lists and transaction monitoring, which transaction monitoring, it'll get a small fraction. But our data set allows it to match against current account base, which kind of, it has a red flag, it triggers the enhanced due diligence, and that's when they investigate it with more context. And then they file the report for FinCEN in US or FinTrack in Canada.
So do you know if any of this reporting that you've been involved actually made it as far as prosecution, at least in Canada?
Yes, so we did a proof of concept with one of the top 5 banks here in Canada. One of the red flags they got, they were able to dismantle a multi-million-dollar ring consisting of 14 or more massage parlors that were trafficking. And we don't really get a lot of details about it, but just because, it was a proof of concept, they shared the details.
So are we going to see more of that cooperation with the banking industry and your organization and others like yours sharing this type of data, your research that may lead to, prosecutions in the future?
Yeah, so we, in 2019, I think they just released the human trafficking checkbox. So the FinCEN released it, so they get to check it when there's a suspicious activity report. So we promote that, we provide training, we provide the data set, we provide the red flags and typologies. We help them integrate anti-human trafficking programs. Now, it's not a requirement in order for them to do this. Some of them, they just don't do it because it affects their bottom line. It actually costs them to implement these programs. But we are seeing more and more, not only financial institutions like banks, but also cryptocurrency exchanges are adopting this now.
Okay, so Vic, your take on it?
Yes, so there is a big thing that needs to be addressed in this as well, guys, and I share with you the point that indeed, I spoke before about that cooperation between the private and the public. And one of the things that through my interviews that I did with a lot of international organizations on the subject was the siloing of that information and the way that information is being obtained. So when we discussed about it, the majority of them, almost unequivocally, all of them said that we have an issue. At the law enforcement perspective, we have an issue, which is the lack of data. And this is what comes from them. And why is there a lack of data on the law enforcement side? It's because the information is being gathered by the private, but the law enforcement is not being able to collect that information in a manner that can be adjudicated, for instance, that can be put forward into prosecutions. Like when I was talking with people about what ISIS was doing, what Boko Haram was doing with human trafficking, they were all telling me the same thing. We know they're doing it, but there's a lack of data because we don't have that information that we can utilize. So now the question comes, if we're all collecting that data, if the private sector, like Larry says and Morgan, are collecting that data, are we collecting that data in a manner that we can utilize it, that we can share it with law enforcement, and then we can put forward for prosecutions? Because that's where the key part comes. Yes, we take down an organization by disrupting. But if there are no prosecutions, what's going to happen is, like Morgan says, they're just going to revive somewhere else under a different name, a different scenario, and they're just going to keep on doing the same thing. A way of preventing that, it's by continuously putting forward prosecutions, right? And actually held these people accountable for what they're doing. So another point then comes in place is that law enforcement structures in many of those countries of the origin might not be existent. The rule of law might not necessarily be as functional as it is in Canada or the United States. So we need to realize, how do we collect that data? The majority of the times, it's because the private sector has access to those information, to that data, something that the law enforcement in a country in Africa might not have, for instance, right? So now we need to develop that cooperation.
So,
Victor, let me add one thing. What Vic hit upon it, and this is the actual big problem. Part of the work I did inside the government was, how does law enforcement share in the United States? Big project I did, but there are 18,000 federal, tribal, state, and local law enforcement agencies in the United States. You think it's tough to share information? Try sharing information with all of those folks. Then add on top of it, one of the projects I did at the Department of Homeland Security was consolidation of the terrorist watch list. At one time, we used to have 25 separate watch lists we had to look for terrorists on and combine those down. You can't connect the dots unless you collect the dots. And Vic, what he was actually hammering on is, we have to figure out a way between the public and the private sector, which is the essence of community policing. How do we share the dots that we legally can share, but put them in one place to where we can apply advanced technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, but as long as we have all of these separate silos, we will never, ever, ever be able to connect those dots. And because we can't connect those dots, human traffickers and cartels exploit the gaps between the information and between the authority of other places. I didn't mean to hop in, but he has actually hit upon, and that's only a problem the public and private sector can solve. They have to come together. The last thing private sector wants is for a government to come in with a mandate, an unfunded mandate, says you will share all of this information. You'll get a lot of pushback. We got to figure out a way to say, how do we voluntarily figure out a way that everybody's incentivized to put all that information in one place legally, so that we can be more effective at stopping these things before they get a foothold.
And Morgan, there is no magical formula for that. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are successful stories, that you can share. Like, I know that, for instance, in Germany, this is public information, I'm not revealing any secret in here, Germany has been able to utilize information that was collected in Syria and in Iraq by a private organization, which is CISO, and actually utilize that in court. But that information was collected in a manner that could be utilized in court. Right. And this is what we need to be able to get out there, right? We need to have these cooperations, those MOUs established, You need to raise awareness, and you need to say, this is what we can do within the parameters that are possible within the country where you are operating, because each different country has the different judicial systems, right? So you need to make sure that you understand those and that you're cooperating and establishing protocols to exchange that information. You have standard operational procedures that you put in place, and you say, if your data is collected in this manner, we can actually utilize it and further our criminal investigations into these translate them into prosecutions.
So that's a fundamental problem of sharing the data, because then privacy becomes involved in this. And now we have legislation in Europe with GDPR, and we have the PETA here. People are not going to want to share it because of the risk of exposure to this private information. So how do we resolve this issue?
There is a current 314B, I think it's under the Patriot Act, that you're able to share this data within the US. But I mean, even when I try to submit information to law enforcement, they're like, we can't do anything with that because we don't have a production order. So it's kind of counterproductive in Canada, but I know a lot of financial institutions do it in the US.
And Victor, there's an issue Vic was raising too, is that we run into, I've worked across the globe too, many different countries. For example, one of my friends was one of the guys who hunted Pablo Escobar. They had a problem with some of the wiretaps and stuff done that they could not use those in US courts because they were not collected according to US standards. You could not submit evidence in a Canadian court unless it was collected according to Canadian standards, right? So there is no magic way to bypass the law to say, well, we can get that stuff and put it in here. At the end of the day, Vic hit it. We've got to have MOUs and ways that we can collect certain kinds of information without affecting privacy and be able to submit that. But I tell you what's going to happen. Either people will do it voluntarily and they'll figure out a way to get it done now, or this is what will happen. Government will eventually get together around the world and let's start legislating things and start saying you will do this, and it will be an added cost on top of everything else that they're doing. It's always cheaper to do it now than it is to do it later.
So you want to just quickly explain to the audience, I don't know if they know what an MOU is. So
Memorandum of Understanding. And then basically it's like a letter of intent if you're in a business environment, but an MOU just basically says, you agree to do this, we agree to do this. We sign on the bottom line. We basically have our boundaries of how we're going to work together and operate together. And most places, it doesn't have to, most MOUs aren't really that fancy. There may be 1 to 2 pages. Even something as simple, if you're in law enforcement, is how does a police agency share body camera video with a prosecutor? It's an MOU. Here's how we'll share it. Here's what we'll do. So, but don't kid yourself. The MOU is simple to do. It's difficult to execute on, and it's difficult to get agreement on. Once you get it done, it's a very simple document. But getting something that can work across the U.S. and Canada, or much less between Saskatchewan and Regina, or Ontario, it's tough to solve it in our own backyard, much less across international borders.
Mm.
Hey, did you like the way I threw out those provinces? Like I knew those.
Yeah.
I'm from the U.S.
Cool.
And you see, and now we come back to the initial topic of the conversation when we're talking about everything being transnational and everything being done over the web, right? Like we're talking about, like goes more into your expertise on the cyber portion. Now we're talking about, having the servers in one country and the people operating in another country and then bouncing out different IP addresses. And how do you investigate that? How do you do that in countries where the infrastructure is not there, right? Like Interpol it's just launching a new initiative to try to raise cyber capacity in 49 countries in Africa. UNODC and Interpol finally decided that if they work together on projects, they might be able to tackle them in a better way. So everything is possible. We can always find a million reasons to complicate a procedure, but at the end of the day, you just need to go down to the basics. What is it? Is human trafficking? Is being committed by who? A criminal organization, transnational? Well, involve the stakeholders that need to be involved and sign whatever protocols they need to sign between them. This is not, criminals have figured that long time ago. If they do it complicated enough, law enforcement is going to have a hard time getting to us, right? So we should have learned from the lessons from the past and be able to put that in people and cooperate together, break down those silos within our own organizations, and then, raise our hand to the private, sit down, discuss, raise awareness. Oh, yes, we know it's going to be difficult, but what can we do to make it work? And if you start from that point, well, everything becomes easier from then.
So have we had a lot of cooperation from different countries? Is there some sort of group involved in putting all these organizations together, getting technically we call it an API, and that you can just query and get your data that you want electronically, but is there something that the organization, the countries, everyone that's affected by the human trafficking, they all know it exists. Are they all willing to do something about it and doing, having the memorandums out there and saying, let's deal with this? Is there anything out there that says, let's tackle this as a problem internationally, because it is an international issue? Is there anything out there that we could speak to, Morgan? Yeah, you.
Good question. I think Larry's probably closer to that than I am. A lot of my work stayed at the intelligence level, so I was working government to government. I will tell you, there's always interagency and international working groups, whether it's drug trafficking, human trafficking. The real question is, and this is where Larry and the work that he's doing in his organization is very vital, is how do you bring that the private sector? It's not that the private sector has less constraints than government does. In other words, I could look into something as a private individual that, if I were law enforcement, would either require a predicate offense or a lawful order. So there are ways that you can not get around the law, but there's ways that if you understand it, I can do things as a private citizen. We have what we call the Fourth Amendment down here, search and seizure. I'm not bound by it because I'm not an agent of the government. I'm not a law enforcement officer. So I could actually, if I wanted to, Victor, if you were in the United States, I could break into your house, find 10 kilos of cocaine, turn it over to the police. Now, you might charge me with trespassing, but they would charge you with possession of cocaine. So, but if you told me as a law enforcement officer, go see what Victor has in his house, then I'm an agent of the government. So there's that. We have to be very careful. And let me let Larry answer that, because I know, Larry, you've been doing stuff. You've worked with law enforcement a lot too. And there has to be a very clear line about being an agent of the government and being a private organization that assists law enforcement.
Yeah, so we do a lot of data collection right now in over 120 countries. We did operations in about 40 countries last year, but we just started, we're going to be releasing our API soon for the dark web data. We do have data sets where we have a Maltego plugin or Polarity, and we'll be doing our human trafficking data in the API soon. So stuff like that will be available for law enforcement. They usually come to me with cases for assistance, but yeah, we can't just send them info and have them look into it. Like DHS, for instance, they require it to come from local law enforcement. They're more jurisdictional, but whereas IRS, they're more federal and they can actually go in other countries. So it's quite complicated when you're trying to maneuver and you're new, especially jurisdictionally.
So that means that with your API and with other organizations that making access to this data, then law enforcement can do the extractions themselves and correlate it themselves and build the cases themselves, so that it bypasses the not invented here syndrome, and it's under their control, so it can follow the evidentiary procedures that are required for each.
Yeah, so we provide data to law enforcement at no cost, and we work with them. But generally how it goes is we submit them the data, and what they do is they run it through their systems and they tell us what hit. And that's basically your 0 and a 1, a zero knowledge proof. So they're not sharing anything back with us. We just know that they got a hit, so we can then do open source intelligence or run it through other systems to try to get additional context or information. So that's usually the process we go by.
Okay, so that means that applications like the Maltego and all the others that the investigators can now utilize to build their cases for individuals that are in your database. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
They'll be able to use that. And I mean, it's governments and law enforcement, they have, several systems that they use and databases they connect with. So, them sending us back the hits, that's kind of the most important part, because we need to know what to investigate and why, for instance.
So are we Vic, are you seeing this type of cooperation with the private organizations giving you access to data that you can use for investigations?
Well, what I had seen in the past was like several private companies or organizations that what happens is that their conscience through awareness raising campaigns that we had and human trafficking forums and UN resolutions that showcase the human traffickings out there fought, it's that those companies are coming forward and they're trying to establish partnerships with government organizations. So I can give you an instance from 4, 5, 6 years ago when I was already going to international conferences on the subject of human trafficking and how to fight human trafficking globally. You would have companies like Facebook, like Airbnb, like Uber, like what's his name, Western Union, sitting down in those conferences, learning about what is human trafficking, learning how are these organizations operating, what are they doing by utilizing our services to further their criminal activity. So Western Union started realizing that they're being used to transfer money and for the money of the criminal activities or the criminal organizations from A to Z, from the victims to the perpetrators or to the exploiters. Now you have Airbnb that knows that their properties are being used. You have, so all these people come together. Facebook knows that their platforms are being used for recruitment, right? So what do they do about it? It's that once we come back to the basic, right? They will put on procedures in place so that law enforcement can apply to obtain that information. But what is different on our side from what Larry's ways of obtaining information is that we cannot get that information without having a judicial authorization for that, right? We need to go through legal channels to be able to get that information. So what Larry could probably obtain without doing so, for us, it's going to be much a longer route to obtain that information.
So is Facebook and all the other organizations actually sharing their data with law enforcement, whether Interpol or RCMP or FBI, wherever? Are they actively sharing this information? Like if you go to them as a Canadian police, you have to issue a production order for them to give you all this information. But as far as I know, the production order is very targeted. You're focused on one person. What about the periphery that maybe, there might be more involvement in the actual crime by others that are associated with this person, but you only have information for that person. So, it's like, known associates of these people, but first, is this happening that you can actually spread the requests out when you see that this person may not be a kingpin, and you can now go after his known associates, and Facebook will give you all the connections that this individual has? Or do we still have to rely on Larry to supply the information and somehow extract it out of Facebook or Uber or whatever, and take that information and then give you the association so you could start the prosecution process?
Mm-hmm. So prosecution, it's really far at this stage, Victor. So when you're at that stage, you're really on the gathering intel portion of it. And yes, Larry has a great role to play in that, because those links might already be established by him, right? And sometimes, you need to have those links established, or that intel provided to you, so that you can after initiate an investigation and go from there. So a law enforcement cannot just do a production order based on, think so, believe so, might be, might not be. We need to have, some more substance, some more data than that will substantiate for you applying for a production order and then actually be granted the production order by or the judicial authorization by a court judge, right? So sometimes Larry might have as an intelligence portion would be able to be utilized by law enforcement, but law enforcement still has to do their own investigation. Now, what there is in place with organizations like Facebook and everything else is that you can request that information to them, and that's what they provide you. It's the path of how to gather that information, how to submit your request, and how to who to submit them to in order to obtain that information. But at the same time, what's happening now with the new companies coming in on social media almost on a daily basis is that many of them are not even keeping information on those servers. So you have a real-time exchange of information, real-time messaging, real-time transfers and picture exchanging and everything else of exploitation, that it's not being kept in any server. So how do you get that information? And that's a real issue.
Yeah, that's been a huge challenge for the intelligence agencies like CIA, CSIS, MI5, MI6. It's once we start getting all of these encrypted communication platforms like Telegram, like Signal and stuff, it's very difficult to break things in transit because it's good encryption. So we start looking at what are the things we can do to get it before it's transmitted, get it after it's transmitted. The one thing we're lacking here, we talk a lot about technology, but I will tell you, one of the things when I used to instruct on behavior analysis, and when we were teaching people at the NSA on interview and interrogation behavior analysis, people got to rely on machines too much. We have a lot of great technology out there, but at the end of the day, law enforcement still needs to develop human sources of intelligence. We've got to find people that are inside these organizations that are feeding us back this targeting information so we can be very specific. There are ways to get information out of Facebook with a search warrant, what we call in the United States a search warrant, or the feds can have national security letters or subpoenas that require a lower level of proof. But at the end of the day, the ability to incorporate Larry's data into a request back to Facebook to say, we have all of this, because you can't go on a fishing expedition. That's the one thing that will hurt our efforts to try and combat this stuff is we get too many agencies just saying, hey, tell me everything about Victor Beitner and anybody he's ever talked to. That's a little broad and that gets into huge privacy issues, right? But if I can say, Victor's talking to these three people, we have data from Larry that says they're also involved in this. Now you're getting to that level of proof to where we can say, hey, that's good enough. That's good enough for a search warrant or a subpoena or a production order to say, yeah, we want to collect that information. But guess what it boils down to? It's all processes, procedures, policies. The data is there. How you get the data is an issue of law. It's an issue of policy. But the better we can get, I will tell you, at some point, we will get to the point of where artificial intelligence has the cognitive ability of humans to where it can recognize these types of phrases and stuff to say, this is very indicative of grooming behavior. This is very indicative of somebody doing this. Until then, we still need even if you collect it, we still need human analysts to be able to take a look at it to make qualitative decisions to say, because there's this whole 5-step process, collect, fuse, analyze, produce, disseminate. We can automate a lot of the collection and fusion process and even the initial part of the analysis, but at some point, people like Vic are going to have to put their eyes on it. People like Larry are going to have to put their eyes on it and make qualitative decisions about, we need to go this way with this. Machines can tell you what, and who, but they can't give you the qualitative experience that a Vic has after 19 years of doing this stuff to say, based on my training and experience, this is indicative of this, this, and this. It still requires humans to go into court and provide orders. So I love technology, but let's not forget humans are a big piece of this, and we've got to keep identifying and developing sources and great analysts like Larry and Vic, because technology is not the solution. Technology is a tool and part of an overall bigger solution.
Yeah. So I want to go back to something about terrorism and the relationship between terrorism and human trafficking and the recent cyber attacks that everyone is going through, all the ransomware attacks. So Vic, What's your take on how can we, like when in our previous discussions you talked about the fact that if there's an association to terrorism, the human trafficking gets put to the side. So it's not the focal point because people are more interested in preventing terror attacks as opposed to human trafficking, and they may be the same groups that are involved in this. So what have you seen?
So that was a big point of my discussions at the international level with the people that I met, that I interviewed on those panels, is that we are starting to get what we call a tunnel vision per se. And this is what happens is that you'll have an expert, me, okay, let's say I'm an SME on human trafficking, right? Well, my buddy is going to be an SME on terrorism. He's going to be a perfect guy for counterterrorism. But you know what? He's probably investigating the people that are, going Canadians. We're talking about Canadians or Americans that go to Syria, Iraq, Nigeria, and they join these terrorist organizations, right? And what is the major thing that we're seeing coming out of there, other than the terrorist attacks that they conduct? It's all the atrocities that they do. And the majority of the atrocities are linked to what? Human trafficking. Here in Canada, we call human trafficking majority of the time sexual exploitation, right? Now you have the typical massage parlor cases where that Larry talked about it, sexual exploitation going on, online platforms of escorts and this and that. Fine, that's one type of human trafficking. What about forced labor? What about slavery? What about child soldiers? What about organ removal? Those are all other forms of forced marriage. Those are all other forms of human trafficking, sometimes being committed by, Western citizens that went to those countries where they're perpetrating those activities. But you will never hear about any of them being, accused or sentenced for human trafficking accusations, because we're focusing on what we know. So if you have someone that is committing, like Morgan, for instance, he talked about the cartels a few times. Cartels are involved in human trafficking for the longest time. Now, UNODC is trying to discuss with the OECE the links between human trafficking and terrorism financing. But where is that data, right? So we're focusing on something. You will have the people focusing on the terrorism portion, but they will completely forget about the all that it's surrounding that terrorist organization. How do they survive? What makes people join their groups, right? So this is all involving a siloed approach to what we know. And if we only know counterterrorism, we will focus on counterterrorism. If we only know human trafficking, we'll focus on human trafficking. But we need to break the silos and bridge those accusations where they come together. And quite honestly, at international level, human trafficking, it's very often being associated with other things, organized crime, terrorism, you name it. So we need to make those links, and we need to be able to, not only focus on what we know and be able to get out of our, siloed vision. Our expertise sometimes might be a little bit biased, and we might be creating our own silos ourselves by only looking at what we know.
So when all you have is a hammer, all the world is a nail. If you know only one hammer, everything's the same problem.
Yeah. So you spoke about cartels. I was listening to someone talk. He's saying that today the cartels are making $14 million a day and the southern borders, bringing people into and distributing them throughout the United States. That's a lot of money for these cartels. Our time is running a bit short, but we have a couple of questions from Andrew. From Mark. Let's start with Mark. Need International ISP has come together to block the bad IP addresses. I don't know how we could answer that.
Well,
But-
Victor, I think the real quick question is, it goes back to that case I was talking about when Microsoft collaborated with the other organizations to sinkhole some of these IPs and stuff. And